are back for the last couple sessions of AgEx 2024. We have an exciting afternoon with some interesting perspectives and insights. I'd like to welcome Morgan Camley from Dentons Canada to provide her keynote, Managing the Political Risks of Farming, the Impact of Animal Rights Organizations' Direct Actions on Agribusiness. Morgan is a partner, leader of the National Agribusiness Sector Group, and leader of the Litigation and Dispute Resolution Practice Group with Dentons in Vancouver. Over the course of her career, she has distinguished herself as a results-driven lawyer who brings extensive experience in complex commercial litigation, agribusiness, public and administrative law, appellate practice, and Aboriginal law, as well as criminal and municipal law. Morgan represents a diverse range of clients in arbitration and court at both the trial and appellate level and administrative boards. Born and raised in Vancouver, Morgan has an intimate familiarity with the culture and nuances of the local, legal, and business communities and community at large. Her familiarity extends beyond BC's borders with the national and global exposure she's gained during her academic years, which took her from New Brunswick to Ontario and all the way to China. Morgan's professional path has been equally diverse and enriching as she started her career as a judicial law clerk at the British Columbia Supreme Court. So please help me welcome Morgan to the stage.
Really, all that means is that I became an ag lawyer so I could wear jeans whenever I wanted and not a suit. So that's really what that's about. So folks, thanks very much for having me here today. This is a topic that I'm weirdly obsessed about. It's something that I stumbled across in my practice, gosh, maybe about 10 years ago, beginning to see the rise, no, a bit longer than that, about 12 years ago, seeing the rise of producers and processors being targeted by animal rights groups. In fact, I don't know, there might be some animal rights folks here now, and we may end up somewhere in the dark web. That's how things are becoming, that it's a particularly scary time for you folks to be trying to do your business. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more, there's our title, a little bit more about me. I love that I'm supposed to be able to read that. I need to change my glasses, apparently. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a lawyer for almost 20 years. I practice downtown. But I'll tell you, my entrance into being an ag lawyer, I come by it honestly. My family used to have a dairy farm out on Sylvester Road out in Mission. And my second cousin was the director of the 4-H forever. So I spent my childhood mucking out stalls and jumping in hay bales and not drinking the milk that my cousin would give me because it did not come from a carton. And for a city kid, that is tough. In law school, I lived on a little island off of Kingston where it was an agricultural island quite by accident, and spent most of law school helping my neighbors do chickens and turkeys, which I didn't know what that meant until I actually arrived and found out that that meant we were really taking them from the beginning to the end. And then I got to bring one home with me. Milking, haying, which is the hardest thing I've ever done next to sheep shearing, and lambing and calves and all sorts of stuff. So I come by this honestly and a real passion for the work that you folks do, and so I'm really grateful to be here. My practice includes a lot of work acting, as I say, on behalf of producers and processors. I appear in front of a bunch of the regulatory boards, as well as defending clients who've been charged with criminal matters in provincial court. And so this is an area that over the years, whether it's tomatoes, chickens, you name it, I've had the real pleasure of assisting you folks. So some of the trends that I want to take you through in this area, I mean, I imagine that this is something that is, you've heard, I think, with your talk from the senator this morning, the cybersecurity topic earlier. This is a growing topic, and one that if you haven't thought about it in your business, you need to be thinking about it. Because I can assure you that animal rights activists are spending all their time thinking about you, and thinking about you in a way that is about entering your businesses and bringing them to an end. This is a political fight that you are part of, whether you want to be in it or not. This is about ending the growth of proteins in Canada and moving Canadians to a plant-based diet. that's fine to have that view. It's okay to have that as your personal goal, but it's the tactics that are being employed by animal rights activists to bring that about, which move us out of the political realm and further into the criminal realm in my perspective. And unfortunately, it's volunteering a lot of processors and producers into that realm as well. So some of the issues that we've seen across Canada, governments have addressed through enhanced trespass laws. That hasn't happened in British Columbia. And you heard this morning from the Senator about the biosecurity law and some of the changes that have happened to that, which weaken the protections that are potentially being afforded to processors and producers. But in particular, trespass has been an issue in British Columbia. We see it with the occupation of farms. We see it with the secret planting of cameras. And we see it with the language that's directed at politicians, which is about the only people that can do this work are the animal rights activists. And a big part of what I do in my work is try to debunk that idea, that in fact, we don't really want politically motivated actors in any situation driving the bus in terms of enforcement. And I'll just use the SPCA as an example. The SPCA has an enforcement right in this province under legislation to be one of the arms that investigates, enforces, and then recommends to Crown whether or not prosecutions should happen with respect to animal cruelty. That's fine. We need to have people who are expert to investigate that. But the concern that I raise in respect of that particular situation is that the SPCA also fundraises off of their enforcement. That's a problem in my submission. It's a problem because I certainly wouldn't want the Vancouver Police or the Abbotsford Police to be sending out a fundraising newsletter to Abbotsford or Vancouver citizens saying, these are the number of arrests we've made, please give us more money so we can continue on with our enforcement procedures. We want to have a clean line in my submission between the enforcement agencies and the agencies that are out seeking to fundraise off of their efforts. And the reason is we want to make sure that any enforcement efforts are done for pure reasons. They're done because there isn't a conflict of interest that exists between the enforcement agency and their coffers. And so when we see things like issues like trespass and the organizations that investigate and enforce those, we need to be suspect in my submission of some of the agencies that are being brought forward that are not protecting farmers, but that are focusing on the political aspect of this in terms of the animal rights activists. One of the next issue that we have to deal with is animal theft. And often when you see an invasion of a farm or an occupation of a farm, animal rights activists will leave taking a trophy with them or want to release animals into the wild, so to speak. Or they take them as poster animals as a way to sort of demonstrate to their followers their success and their actions. The important piece here to keep in mind, particularly with animal rights organizations, is this is a form of clickbait. A lot of what's happening in terms of the posts and the actions that animal rights activists are taking is about driving clicks, driving views, and driving fundraising. So when you look at the websites, when they've invaded a farm, taken an animal, the various steps that they take, it immediately heads up onto their website, and it's a form of fundraising. And so again, the reason why I raise that is that should be an indicator for Crown and for police and other enforcement agencies that these are not safe actors to be dealing with. And I'll get to that a little bit more later. So the next one is the undercover videos to support lawsuits. Again, this is that clickbait piece. This is about the ability to put media up on websites to be able to drive clicks, fundraising to it. The big important thing here, and you'll hear me talk about this fairly often through my presentation, is we don't live in a world anymore where a photograph is a photograph is a photograph. It used to be that way, and As I take you to the test case that I'm going to talk to you about, our courts have not caught up, and that is one of the risks that you face as producers and processors, is that our courts, I was saying over here earlier that just a couple years ago I had to explain to a judge what Facebook is. And one of the issues with that is it's all old people on Facebook, so why doesn't the judge know what Facebook is? So we're dealing with a real disconnect between the speed with which technology is changing and the slow way in which the law is grinding. So in law, there's the photograph test, which is essentially, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And if you can see it in the photograph, that's good evidence. Well, we all know with disinformation and misinformation that that is not the case anymore. And the rise of AI, I'll talk a little bit more about, is a significant issue. We see growing campaigns for animal protection legislation, the huge lobbying efforts that are happening behind the scenes by animal rights activists to get the attention of politicians, I would say is not dissimilar to the kind of organized effort that we see in a lot of the American lobbying efforts around the NRA and those kinds of organizations. These are highly, highly sophisticated organizations that are not Canadian only. These are international organizations that have an enormous budget to be able to target politicians that they think that they can sway and be able to influence legislation in Canada. And ultimately where the goal is to create a kind of personhood for animals. And so, again, we can have that philosophical debate. I can tell you a lot of my friends in Vancouver would agree with that 100%. I don't actually tell them a lot of what I do for a living for that reason, but nevertheless, that's not a debate that should be happening behind closed doors. That's a debate that should be happening in the open, and it shouldn't be funded by huge multinational organizations that have clandestine campaigns and misinformation campaigns. Another one is tapping into other social justice movements. This is another area where I think the farm industry really needs to be thinking broadly beyond the people that you serve, and so your own kind of echo chamber, so to speak, because your opponents in the animal rights group are reaching out broadly, and they're making partnerships around social justice, public health, and climate change. These are very big topics which are also equally funded in ways that far outstrip many of the councils that support some of the protein makers in Canada. So, for example, around public health, we see public health orders being made in British Columbia around mink, for example, and ending the farming of mink under what I've argued on behalf of mink farmers as a guise for a public health issue. That's before the courts right now. We're making our way through, but the argument that we will make and have made publicly is that governments have the right to end farms and farming practices to change things, but they need to do it in a transparent way, and they need to do it in a way that affords farmers compensation in those contexts. But what's important here is through a lobbying effort, we say governments are impacted to make decisions about farming based on other issues. So COVID came along, there was a concern that mink were carriers. That was the end of mink farming in British Columbia. That's the use of another aspect of our civil society to get at an end goal. Same thing with climate change. In terms of the language that we now hear from animal rights activists, particularly around climate change, is about the impact of farming in terms of resource use and the impact on climate. Again, that's a political issue. It's an issue that is ripe for disinformation. And so I raise that not to necessarily strongly disagree with it or debunk it, but simply to say that these issues are being brought up they may have some merit in them at their core, but then they're taken on a whole other path through misinformation. And so this is something that I think that the farming industries and the councils really need to be aware of as a significant issue. And we see some changes in some ways in which folks are addressing those issues. But again, I come back to just the incredibly sophisticated way that these issues are woven in together, and the response needs to be equally sophisticated. The campaigns directed at retailers, restaurant, and food services industries are huge. That's the number one way in which we see the impact of animal rights organizations on farming is by going after the end consumer or going after the retailer. Loblaws in particular is one of the examples which we often see being targeted in terms of who they use as their suppliers and processors. And so there's the campaign is extensive and moves beyond just aiming at the farmer and the processor. Youth involvement is huge. The amount of information and disinformation that's on TikTok and YouTube, and it's there for the purpose of recruiting youth. I have a 13-year-old who's currently going through a vegetarian phase. It's fine, I can cook lentils. How we got there is through TikTok. And so it's important to keep in mind that, again, what you're in right now is an information war. And it's really important right now to be countering those kinds of stories with, frankly, what I see on your farms as good farming practices, and farming practices that have grown over the years, and families that are committed to this kind of work. And so, again, I raise this because it is an active and ongoing effort on the part of activists to continue to bring in new recruits. And finally, the growing right to rescue movement, which is combines sort of all of the above, which is the disinformation, which says that there's somehow a right of animal activists to be part of the investigation process. There's a right to rescue animals that are being mistreated, in their opinion. And it means that they have a right to enter private property, and there's a significant overall justification for that. So AI-generated images. If you haven't spent much time thinking about AI, you really need to. It's changing our world. I'll tell you from a lawyer's perspective, I look at the young folks in my office and I kind of shake my head and think, we're not going to have a lot of you around much longer because AI can do faster what a lot of you young folks can do. I'm too old for it to hit me. I have value add built in. But in terms of young folks, it's hitting us, and it's hitting us in a way and at a speed that none of us expected. That is particularly true in terms of image generation and the ability to not decipher what is a real image and what is an AI-generated image. And I think you guys had a demonstration about that in the last talk. And so that's what's happening in terms of evidence that's going before courts. And so I'll share with you when we get to the case study with a bit more detail about that. But that's really the piece that brought me into this, is the risk that we face in terms of the rapid changing technology and the inability or the lack of funds, frankly, to keep up with it on the side of the processors and the producers. And so from your various councils and associations, I hope that you'll put a bit of pressure on them to be thinking about this, because this is really a widespread issue that if we don't, as an industry, get on top of, we're going to be lost to it. And again, the last point is lost to it both politically, lost to it legally, but also in terms of public engagement. We see that one of the things we know about AI images in particular is that the public has a really hard time deciphering what is true and what is not true. And that's, again, going back to many of us have been raised in the world where a picture is a picture is a picture. And that's something that we need to begin to dispel. And we can partly do that by producing counter speech in terms of our own kinds of images and various things that tell the real story of farming. So what are the impacts on agribusiness? So you are going to see, and I'm sure some of you are already seeing, an increase in trespass, vandalism, espionage, and direct protest. I mean, I have to tell you, as a young lawyer, you never think you get to actually use words like espionage, but here we are in this practice. It is highly sophisticated, and the direct protest piece in particular is something that we've seen in the valley out here with farms being invaded. That's going to continue. You have in Abbotsford sympathetic police, which is helpful, but as those issues increase, and I would suggest without the increased impact of an enhanced trespass law like there are in many other provinces, it's difficult to get to the kind of penalties attached to these offenses that really have an impact. And that's one of the issues when dealing with political protesters, because it's different than a normal citizen who transgresses, is arrested, convicted, does their time or pays their fine, and then the theory on that is, well, they've learned their lesson, they move on with their life. But if you're committed to a cause, this is just the cost of doing business. Doing a 2-year, 2-year less a day sentence in provincial jail is just the cost of doing business. And so we have to, again, really rethink about who are the opponents in these fights, because the normal issues that would motivate citizens to change their behavior don't necessarily exist here. And so we need an enhancement in terms of some of the criminal sanctions. And from a civil sanction perspective, it's very expensive for you to hire me to sue somebody civilly. And I mean, I'm happy to do it, but it's not worth your money, because the reality is, I promise you, the activist that you'd be suing probably doesn't have any money to pay off a lawsuit. They're judgment proof. And in terms of the organizations, it's quite difficult for us to find a connection often to the actual organizations, because the way in which the information is passed to the organizations that then put them on their web pages as clickbait, it's very hard for us to make those links. I have some ideas about that, so I'm looking for a test case. So if anybody gets in trouble, please come and see me, because I do think that the way that we actually begin to deal with this is by going after the organizations themselves, and not only after the individuals that are acting on behalf of the organizations. And I do think that there's a way in which we can go after, sue them civilly, and shut down organizations that way. But it's going to take a bit of work and a bit of convincing of courts and some creation of new laws to be able to do that. Or creation of new law, and then hopefully lobbying politicians to understand that's why this is important. I know in British Columbia, not this election, but the last election was what stopped the moving forward of the Trespass Act, and I understand that there wasn't a lot of appetite to re-engage it, but I wonder in this new climate of near minority government, majority but almost minority government, if there may be some more appetite for that. So if there's lobbyists in the room, that is something that I would suggest you think about, because it's effective, those trespassing acts. The other issue, too, is around public support. And we need to be thinking about, again, this is where disinformation comes in, about trying to be able to help the public understand that there are actually enforcement laws in place around animal cruelty and animal health that are effective. And the issue here isn't that we need more laws or more quasi-legal actors to help enforce them or bring to the table more enforcement, but we actually need to be encouraging the SPCA and the CFIA to actually do their jobs and investigate in a way that is not politically motivated and is focused on sort of the overall protection of the industry. And when I get to the case study next, I'll explain to you my concern about lazy enforcement and the implication for all of us as citizens. The other piece for us is we expect to see an increase in the litigation proceedings between agribusiness and the animal rights groups, but again, we need a test case to be able to do that. And then lastly, I mean, one of the concerns that I think consumers don't recognize is all of this additional effort that processors and producers need to go to protect themselves from these quasi-judicial actors is expensive. Hiring security is expensive. Bringing in cameras into your farms is expensive. And monitoring those is expensive. And so that all leads to an increase in food costs. So it's really about having a rational conversation about how to have safe, healthy animal husbandry, which the majority of the industry practices, and dealing with the bad actors in a way that doesn't drag the whole industry down. So I put this slide up just to give you a sense of the change in enforcement. So the number of animal cruelty investigations has gone up by a little over 3,000 investigations between 2008 and 2023. I can't pull away from that what are somebody not treating their dog well or treating their domestic animals well versus livestock. But the point here is there is a focus on enforcement. I go back to tying that to, in my submission, a connection to the fundraising goals of the BCSPCA. And just, again, query whether it's appropriate to have an enforcement agency who's increasing their enforcement capabilities and efforts, and at the same time making it to be their main spread in their fundraising magazine. And we also see that there's an increase in calls by about 50,000 calls over the period of 2015 to 2022. Again, it's hard for us to break down how many of those actually involve livestock, but what we see again is I think what we can pull from that is either a rise in public awareness in terms of access to enforcement agencies, or a nefarious question about whether or not those are real calls or politically motivated calls to move actors, enforcement agencies, into farms. And finally, the last statistic, I think it's really hard to extrapolate how this impacts livestock, but I put it there just to simply point out that the increase in enforcement and whether or not this is a little lady with 35 cats or an issue that's happening with smaller farms not being able to feed horses in the winter, we don't know. But my point is it's the increase in enforcement that we need to be aware of. So we know that there's some recent direct actions that have happened in British Columbia. Animal Justice is really picking up some of their work in British Columbia with a recent release of surreptitiously obtained footage at a fish farm located in Seychelles. We also know that this site had been inspected and no violations were found, but nevertheless, it was still targeted. And we also know that the SPCA has received hundreds and thousands of hours of video footage. So what that tells us is that the infiltrations are not short, they're long, they're planned out, and they're planned out to gather a significant body of, I'm not going to call it evidence, I'm going to call it information, because as you hear in my next segment, that's one of my big issues right now with how law enforcement is going, is accepting this kind of information from politically motivated actors. So what are your legal risks, and how can you deal with this? Well, one of the issues is even if a complainant is successful, so you've successfully sued somebody in trespass and you have a judgment from the court, good for you. It's kind of useless in many ways because you're often suing somebody that has no money and doesn't care if they get sued. It's the cost of doing business for them. So it's an empty, in many ways, as our Trespass Act stands in British Columbia, it's an empty remedy for people. That's a problem, right? Because it means that when you have, sometimes when you're dealing with law enforcement, they'll say it's a civil matter, go deal with it civilly, but there's really not a lot you can do civilly without costing yourselves a lot of money, without a lot of results in the end. You know, one of the issues too is finding a balance between legitimate protest and and also running businesses on private property. And so, the issue here is that there's been a conflation, particularly around farming, that there's somehow a right for the public to enter into private spaces and take up space in private spaces. And that's something we need to be pushing back on in terms of the misinformation and disinformation piece. These are, for the most part, these are your homes. Like, you're raising your kids there. Your parents may be living there, and the barn is next to you. And to have, 40 people invade your barn is frightening. And so we need to be really talking about sort of the impact of things like trespass and take it out of the realm of sort of academic discussion and really talk about the actual impacts on individuals. The other issue, too, is with animal rights activists providing this information to enforcement agencies and ultimately being passed on to Crown or to boards and various things, is it's really expensive for processors and producers to defend yourselves. You're volunteered into these processes. You suddenly, a camera is placed into your dairy farm. It's there for a few days. There are some issues that may be discovered. Sometimes they're handling issues or training issues. Sometimes they're more serious. But nevertheless, it's not clear if that should mean that you ought to end up in front of a regulator or in front of the provincial court. And for you to get to the end of defending yourself in that could be up in the hundreds of $1,000s, close to $1 million by the time you go through the whole process. So this is serious in terms of the actual legal risk and the financial risk to organizations, particularly if enforcement agencies get involved. And finally, the point of this is, at the end of the day, the impact on the industry and the impact on individual businesses is something you really can't calculate. Is your particular brand of product going to be stopped being purchased if an animal rights organization targets you and begins to create a disinformation campaign? And people sit at a dinner table, at a dinner party, talking about, well, I'm not going to buy this kind of chicken anymore. Did you hear about that dairy farmer over there? And the key piece is the cost of this and the risk of this to industry on that front in terms of consumer confidence is something that we haven't really been able to calculate. So the next one is my little case study. Some of you may be aware of this matter that happened, there's the before time and then the after time. So let me calculate to the before time. A couple years before the pandemic, you may have seen in the news an issue involving chickens and some video that was taken by one of Mercy for Animals had obtained videos through an employee that they had planted in the operation, and he had taken hours and hours and hours and hours of videos. And the issue there was that the Elite Farms was charged, as was my client, Safina Foods, which is a large processor. And they were charged initially with, 34 counts, 25 counts, 12 counts. There we go, 12 counts. It was a lot of improper loading of chickens. The original fine that the CFIA was seeking was in the many tens of millions of dollars. From my client and from Elite Farms. My concern about this file, everything I'm telling you is public. It's everything that we've made submissions on. My initial concern when I saw the videos was the way in which the individual who committed the concerning acts was targeted. Our concern had been that the animal rights activist had targeted somebody with a diminished capacity on the chicken catching crew and had encouraged him, this is our theory of the case, was that had potentially encouraged him to be involved in some of the acts. And the reason why that's a concern is, again, it goes back to my point about a video, a photograph is not necessarily a video or a photograph anymore. And the videos that were put before the court were not continuous. They were stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. So we don't know what happens in the stop parts before the start happens again. One of the concerns in criminal law is around inducements, whether or not you can say to somebody, hey, I won't beat you up if you do this. I'll give you drugs if you do this. I'll give you money if you do this. I'll be your friend if you do this. And when we have investigators who are not actually legally trained investigators involved in these kinds of highly sophisticated covert operations, what we don't have, if you had a police officer involved, is protection from things like that. So what I'm arguing here isn't that abuses on farms should be covered up. Absolutely not. We should all be encouraging and proud of a high standard of animal husbandry and high standard of care for animals. But what we should all be up in arms about is the failure of our enforcement agencies and the Crown to not recognize that this is not safe evidence, that this is evidence that's produced by political actors for the purpose of driving clickbait for their organizations and for the purposes of arriving at a political result, which is to end animal consumption in Canada. And so what we have when you have a investigator in there, a trained investigator, police officer, RCMP, SPCA, is you have protections from the criminal code. You have protections from the charter. You have the Police Act. You have the BC SPCA Act. You have an overlay of ethics that exist over the investigator that does not exist over a political actor who's involved in their own thought-up investigation. We should all be very concerned about that and should be very concerned that the courts are willing to accept that. Now, in this case, it was the CFIA that was investigating, and the accused made a number of these recordings. We had argued that they weren't admissible. I'll tell you that 6 years ago, 7 years ago, this was my whole life during the pandemic was this case. We lost that argument before the court, and the court accepted the admissibility of these videos on the basis that we could cross-examine the videographer about them. I think if I was going to run this case today, I would have a different result from courts, because I do think that it's a bit more of a notorious fact now about the risk of disinformation and AI and the way in which we can doctor videos. And this was happening, this case came up just on the cusp of that before it had become something that we saw on a regular occasion in the news. So I think that if we're in a position again where, and I have had success in the last couple of years dealing with the SPCA by saying, we're not going to submit to an interview, we're not coming in, we have no reason to talk to you, you have no evidence other than a politically motivated video that I don't believe that the court will accept, and charges haven't been forthcoming. And so I think that that's one of the pieces that we do need to be talking about as an industry, is calling out law enforcement agencies, calling out investigative agencies, calling out Crown, and really requiring them to do their job. If there's a significant concern with respect to acts that are happening on a particular farm, there are mechanisms for proper investigators to investigate that. There's no reason with a warrant issued by a judge that the SPCA couldn't put an undercover chicken catcher in place to supervise and investigate the chicken catching that's going on to make sure that it fits within the safety codes and the animal health codes. It's expensive. It requires enforcement agencies to plan out investigations, but we should not, in my submission as Canadians, accept a shortcut that limits the very clear constitutional and charter and criminal protections that exist in the laws. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you today, which is kind of my big concern, ringing the bell that this is a train that's coming your way. It's already actually hit the station. It's bringing in another one as well, and another one and another one. I'm happy to answer questions. I find that we really are able to sort of generate a good discussion through the questions rather than just hearing me drone on. So if there's any questions, I'd be really pleased to answer them. I think you can use your phone to hit on the QR code, and then there we go. See, I'm actually not that technical, so that's why I had to become a lawyer. Okay, great. Oh yeah, you can also shout out questions. Yes. Oh, tell me how. I think that is such an important point, and I'll say in the elite farm matter, that was a really important point. I mean, even I've never caught chickens before. Thank goodness, it looks like a terrible job. And one of the big important pieces that I had to learn as a lawyer was what is good catching practice and what isn't, and what is something that's cruel and what is you're not doing the flip properly, and that's just a corrective training piece. And so your point is very important, that if you don't actually have training in the industry with the particular animal and what's happening as an industry norm on farms, you're not going to be able to assess a video, assess a witness statement in a way that has any kind of clarity attached to it. So I think that's a very good point. I'm going to look into that. So thank you. And it's nice to hear a Newfoundland accent. Ooh, that's a really good one. It's a tough one, right? And I'm a little bit, I have to tell you, I'm a little bit behind right now. And whoever this is, if you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to catch you up on that. I'm not sure where we're at in terms of the Monsanto case, in terms of the flying of seeds into the other property. But I imagine on that one, the right to farm legislation probably helps a little bit there, in terms of being able to continue on in terms of your practice, your farm practice, and there's a certain amount of trespass that's acceptable under the right to farm legislation. But I'm super happy to have a look at that, and because now I'm curious about that. This is the whole fun thing about this practice. It's like, ooh, I haven't thought about that issue. But I imagine that right to farm probably covers some of that. But nevertheless, with any trespass or any nuisance, you want to be able to minimize that as possible and be able to, as a defensible way, be able to demonstrate that you've done everything you can to minimize the impact on neighbors. And that will make the argument in terms of any right to farm issue or defense against a trespass or nuisance issue more defendable. Why is BC lagging? Well, that is a good question. And I think the issue, as I said, I think came up around the 2020 election, where right after the election, the private members bill for the increased issues with trespass sort of fell off the vine. The federal legislation, we're still waiting for that to come in. But I do think it's an important lobbying opportunity. And I think, as I say, with our current government being on such a razor's edge, and now our former agriculture minister back in the saddle as agriculture minister, this is a really important lobbying time for this legislation, and I think it's important to have that conversation. I mean, much like the comment from our friend from Newfoundland, unless you actually have a sense about what's happening on the ground and why there's the current trespass legislation isn't significantly protecting farmers, we need to be lobbying to explain that to government about why that's so important. So my answer is politicians is really all I can say there. So in terms of farmers on social media who encounter animal rights activists, my advice is two things. One is, unless it is defamatory or something that is potentially going to cause you harm, to ignore it. Part of what you're doing when you engage animal rights activists is you are feeding the beast. You're giving them exactly what they want. You're giving them the attention that they want. A big part of my practice is actually defamation. And so often my advice to people who come to me and say, you know, so-and-so said this about me and it's terrible and I want to sue them, which is, well, if we do that, then you're really giving them a much broader platform than you would have to the 27 people who read this post. Now you're now going to make this 35,000 people who will see it because the Vancouver Sun will pick it up. So it's kind of a similar bit of advice, which is, unless it's something that is threatening to you, and if it's physically threatening to you, then call the police. Because the police should know if there are physical threats coming your way, which is not unheard of for farmers and processors. If it's something that you think is defamatory that could have an impact on your business, call me. I'm happy to give you some advice about whether you should proceed to suing somebody. And often what goes into that advice is, are we going to make it bigger? And is there any value in suing? Defamation awards are usually very, very small, and often in these cases they're hard to collect. So, and then if it's not something, if it doesn't fall into any of those two categories, as hard as it is, you've got to ignore it because, as I say, you're just feeding the beast. You know, there's, on terms of what livestock farmers can do, is there are, I think it is, I've seen with some effect farmers who've engaged some security experts just to have a conversation about your farm. We know that drones, your farms are targeted in a really sophisticated way. Maps are being produced about how to enter into farms that are targets. So it is an unfortunate reality that this isn't legal advice I'm giving you. It's just advice that I see from how people are sort of managing this, is that they are engaging security experts to see where their weak points are. Because again, you're dealing with highly sophisticated activists that have covert ops training and various things to be able to conduct their investigations. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. If you see clickbait again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about kind of social media things. Unless it's defamatory or there's a personal threat involved, there's not much you can do. It's freedom of expression. We can say what we want to say in Canada, unless it's hate speech. We can do that. So it's again, I want to say to folks, if you've got a question like this, if something about your farm has come up, please feel free to pick up the phone and give me a call. I'm always happy to have a 5 or 10 minute conversation without the taxi meter going on to give you some advice about whether you actually need to talk to a lawyer about something. I think people are often really afraid to call lawyers because they think the second that they call me, I'm going to put a second mortgage on your house or third or fourth mortgage. I'm really not. My interest is really helping people figure out how to best use lawyers and if you even need a lawyer. And so often we can do that in a 10-minute conversation. Young farmers and students, you are honestly the key to this. My kid teaches me more things about the internet than I even knew existed out there, and the young lawyers in my office do the same. You know, young farmers, this is what you're going to be dealing with some a vengeance going forward. And in some ways, you got to help your parents and grandparents figure this stuff out. So it really is about educating yourself about AI. I cannot stress that enough. That train has left the station. It is coming for all of us. We all have to learn about it and figure out, you know, and there's a lot of great benefits to it, but there's a lot of, like the internet, there's ways in which it's going to cause significant breakdowns in civil society. And so, you know, in terms of it being used as a tool to target industry, that would be the biggest thing I would say is educate yourselves. So yeah, is there a move to give animal charter rights? Yeah, that's where this ultimately is ending up, right? Is an idea of animal personhood, and so we're a ways off from that. But all of this campaigning that's happening right now is aimed towards that. It's about building a case that says farmers and processors cannot be trusted. They are acting behind closed doors. What are they doing back there? We should all be able to see this. We as citizen investigators should be able to go in and as citizen investigators make a determination on whether or not what is happening is safe and fair. And it's about building a broader case to be able to get to a point of being able to ultimately make this argument. Am I getting close? I'm over. Okay. That's it. Folks, if you've got burning questions, please feel free to email me. I'm always happy to chat. Thanks very much.